quite there. There we are. We are live. What's up, YouTube people? Shaggy the Writer coming at you live here from the library, the Anderson Township Library, where I was at the other night. Um, Big shouts out to them just for being so gracious and allowing me to do this here. But I'm just doing a couple things real quick, and then we are literally getting into 1984 for George Orwell's birthday, which is super duper awesome. So, coming up on the last birthdays of cancer season, we have to go live for the Cancer Squad. So huge shouts out to the people over at the r/alternate history hub Discord. Huge shouts out to Against the World G. He and his friend should be sitting up there watching here in a moment too, so I will not be surprised if he's in the building momentarily. Let me do one more thing and then we gotta get cracking on this. I just wanted to start at 7:30 just because it feels good to start on time. Yes. But George Orwell is by far one of the most influential English authors of all time. And his most famous and, I believe, probably most misquoted novel is quite a banger, but it is pretty long, so we're probably not going to be able to get through it in the hour and a half that I have at the library tonight. So we'll still see what we can do. But George Orwell was the pen name of Eric Arthur Blair, born in 1903 in colonial India. He attended boarding school in England, and it was there that he first became aware of the hurtful class prejudice that plagued British society, developing an early sensitivity to the uses and abuses of power. Upon graduating Eton in 1921, Orwell signed on with the Burmese Indian Imperial Police, about which he commented, "In order to hate imperialism, you've got to be a part of it." And his time in Burma affected him profoundly. And he quit without explanation 5 years later, announcing that he was to become a writer. Finding himself nearly penniless and taking a job as a dishwasher, the young writer explored the topic of poverty firsthand in his first published book, Down and Out in Paris and London, 1933, followed soon after by Burmese Days, 1934, which recalled his time in the Imperial Police. Throughout his interest in the plight of individuals attempting to transcend their social roles, came across in such early comic novels as Keep the Asperda Flying, and it wasn't until his impassioned account of the plight of English workers in Road to Wagon Pier in 1937 that the new political consciousness fully blossomed. Around this time, he and his new wife joined an anti-fascist militia at the outbreak of the Civil War in Spain, and is recounted in his Homage to Catalonia, 1938. Though he's perhaps best known for his brilliant satire Animal Farm, 1946, and his classic dystopian novel 1984 from 1949, which followed essay collections such as Inside the Whale, which reflected his continuing concern with very real political and social circumstances of his day. Following the death of his wife in 1945, Orwell contracted tuberculosis, and soon after his second marriage died in 1950 at the age of 46. Man. But yeah, I got his birth date wrong because it was June 25th, but we still in cancer season, so it still counts. Oh my gosh, we're just going to get cracking though. Big shouts out to all of the people over at r/alternate history hub. Huge love to Against the World G, who should be in the building momentarily as well. Oh, huge shouts out to the Noodle Company guy, girl, Nissin, Nissin, this I can't even pronounce their name on Twitter because I don't even have a Twitter, but they have really awesome art. So look for Nissin, like the noodle company. Chapter 1. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast, in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of the colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face more than a meter wide, the face of a man of about 45 with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times it was seldom working, and at the present electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39, had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you and move about everywhere. Big Brother is watching you. The caption beneath it ran. Inside, the flat, fruity voice was reading out the list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice, which came from an oblong metal plaque like a dulled mirror, which formed part of the surface at the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch at the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls, which were of the uniform of the party. His hair very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and the cold of the winter that had just ended. Outside, even though the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the little street eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals. Though the sun was shining, and the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house immediately opposite. Big Brother is watching you. Caption said while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at street level, another poster torn at the corner flapped fitfully in the wind, alternately covering and uncovering the single word Ingsoc. In the far distance, a helicopter skipped down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, and darted away again with a curving flight. It was the police patrol snooping into people's windows. The patrols did not matter, however, only the thought police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and the overfulfillment of the 9th three-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made, above the level of a very low whisper, would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which had the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody, all the time, but at any rate they could plug in your wire wherever they wanted to. You had to live, did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement was scrutinized. Winston kept his back turned to the telescreen. It was safer, though, as he knew well, even a bat can be revealing. A kilometer away, the Ministry of Truth, his place of work, towered vast and white over the grimy landscape. This, he thought with a sort of vague distaste, this was London, chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. He tried to squeeze out some childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this. Were there always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up in the bulks of timber, their windows patched with cardboard, and their roofs with corrugated iron, their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions? And the bomb sites where the plaster dust swirled in the air and the willow herbs straggled over heaps of rubble, and the places where the bombs had cleared a larger path, and there had sprung up some sordid colonies of wooden dwellings like chicken houses. But it was no use, he could not remember. Nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright lit tableaux occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible. The Ministry of Truth, mini-true in news speak, was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramid structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up from terrace after terrace, 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out on its white face in elegant lettering, the three slogans of the party.
War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength.
The Ministry of Truth contained, it said, 3,000 rooms above ground level, and corresponding ramifications below. Scattered about London, there were just 3 other buildings of similar size and appearance. So completely did they dwarf the surrounding architecture that from the roof of the Victory mansions you could see all 4 of them simultaneously. They were the homes of the 4 ministries, between which the entire apparatus of government was divided. The Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. And the Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. And the Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs. In their names in newspeak, Mini True, Mini Pax, Mini Love, Mini Plenty. The Ministry of Love was the really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. It was a place impossible to enter except on local business, and then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hidden gun nests. Even the streets leading up to the outer barriers were roamed by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms armed with jointed truncheons. What is a jointed truncheon? I'm going to have to look a word up later now. Thanks, Orwell. Winston turned round abruptly. He set his features into the expression of quiet optimism which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the ministry at this time of day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen, and he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread, which had to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down from the shelf a bottle of colorless liquid with a plain white label marked Victory Gin. It gave off a sickly, oily smell, as of Chinese rice spirit. Winston poured out nearly a teacupful, nerved himself for a shock, and gulped it down like a dose of medicine. Instantly his face turned scarlet and water ran out of his eyes. The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, in swallowing it, one had the sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club. The next moment, however, the burning in his belly died down and the world looked more cheerful. He took a cigarette from a crumpled pack marked Victory Cigarettes and incautiously held it upright, whereupon the tobacco fell out onto the floor. With the next he was more successful. He went back to the living room and sat down at the small table that stood to the left of the telescreen. From the table drawer he took out a pen holder, a bottle of ink, and a thick quarto-sized black book with a red, black, and marbled cover. For some reason the telescreen in the living room was an unusual position. Instead of being placed, as was normal, in the end wall where it could command the whole room, it was in the longer wall, opposite of the window, To the one side of it there was a shallow alcove, in which Winston was now sitting, and which the flats were built. He'd probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen so far as it went. He could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed in the present position he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that had suggested to him that living that thing that he was now about to do. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. It was a peculiarly beautiful book. Its smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was the kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 past years. He could guess, however, that the book was much older than that. He had seen it lying in the window of a frowsy little junk shop in a slummy quarter of the town. Just what quarter he did not now remember, and he had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Party members were supposed not to go into ordinary shops. Dealing on the free market, it was called. But the rule was not strictly kept because there were various things such as shoelaces and razor blades, which it was impossible to get a hold of in any other way. He had given a quick glance up and down the street, and then had slipped inside and bought the book for $2.50. At the time, he was not conscious of wanting it for any particular purpose. He carried it home guiltily in his briefcase. Even with nothing written in it, it was a compromising possession. The thing that he was about to do was open a diary. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal since there were no longer any laws. But if detected, it would be reasonably certain that it was punishable by death, or at least 25 years in a forced labor camp. Winston fitted a nib into the pen holder and sucked off to get the grease off. The pen was an archaic instrument seldom used even for signatures, and he had procured one furtively and with some difficulty simply because of a feeling that a beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it was usual to dictate everything into the speakwrite, which was of course impossible for his present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink and then faltered just for a second. A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was a divisive act. In small, clumsy letters he wrote, April 4th, 1984. Roll credits. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that it was 1984. It must be around that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and he believed that he had been born in 1944 or 1945. But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom, it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary? For the future, for the unborn? His mind hovered for a moment around the doubtful date on the page, then fetched up with a bump against the new speak word, doublethink. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. For some time he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was that he'd originally intended to say. For weeks past, he had been making ready for this moment, and it never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was transfer paper. The interminable, restless monologue that had been running inside his head literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun to itch unbearably. He dared not stretch it, because if he did so, it would become inflamed. The seconds were ticking by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness in the page in front of him, and the itching skin above his ankle, and the blaring of the music and the slight booziness caused by the gin. Suddenly he began writing in sheer panic, only imperfectly aware of what he was setting down. His small but childish handwriting straggled up and down the page, shedding first its capital letters, and finally even its full stops. April 4th, 1984. Last night to the flicks. All war films. One very good one of a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. Audience much amused by shots of a great huge fat man trying to swim away with a helicopter after him. First you saw him wallowing along in the water like a porpoise. Then you saw him through the helicopter's gun sights, and he was full of holes, and the sea round him had turned pink, and he sank as suddenly as though the holes had let in the water. Audience shouting with laughter when he sank. Then you saw a lifeboat full of children with a helicopter hovering over it. There was a middle-aged woman, might have been a Jewess, sitting up in the bow with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. Little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head between her breasts as if he was trying to burrow right into her, and the woman putting her arms around him and comforting him, although she was blue with fright herself. All the time covering him up as much as possible, as if she thought her arms could keep the bullets off of him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb in among the terrific flash, and the boat went all to matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of the child's arm going up, right up into the air. The helicopter with a camera in its nose must have followed it up. There was a lot of applause from the party seats, but a woman down in the prole part of the house suddenly started kicking up a fuss and shouting. They didn't oughter have showed it. Not in front of the kids. They ain't right. Not in front of them kids. It ain't. Until the police turned her out. I don't suppose anything happened to her. Nobody cares what proles say. Typical pro reaction. They never. Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from cramp. He did not know what made him pour out this stream of rubbish. But the curious thing was that, while he was doing so, a totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind, to a point where he felt almost equal to writing it down. It was, he now realized, because of this other incident that he had suddenly decided to come home and begin the diary today. It had happened that morning at the ministry, if anything so nebulous could be said to happen. It was nearly 1100 in the records department where Winston worked. They were dragging the chairs out of the cubicles and groping them in the center of the hall, opposite of the big telescreen, in preparation for the 2 minutes of hate. Winston was just taking his place at one of the middle rows when two people, whom he knew by sight but had never spoken to, came unexpectedly into the room. One of them was a girl whom he often passed in the corridors. He did not know her name, but he knew that she worked in the fiction department, presumably since he had seen her with oily hands and carrying a spinner. She had some mechanical job on one of the novel-writing machines. She was a bold-looking girl of about 27, with thick dark hair, a freckled face, and swift athletic movements. A narrow scarlet sash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League, was wound several times around the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shapeliness of her hips. Winston had disliked her from the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason. It was because she was a Leo. I'm kidding. It was because of the atmosphere of hockey fields and cold baths and community hikes and general clean-mindedness which she managed to carry about with her. He disliked nearly all women, and especially the young and pretty ones. It was always the women and always the young ones who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies and nosers out of unorthodoxy. But this particular girl gave him the impression of being more dangerous than most. Once, when they had passed in the corridor, she had given him a quick sidelong glance, which seemed to pierce right into him for a moment, had filled him with black terror. The idea had even crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the thought police. That it was true was very unlikely. Still, he continued to feel a peculiar uneasiness which had fear mixed up in it as well as hostility whenever she was anywhere near him. The other person was a man named O'Brien, a member of the inner party and holder of some post so important and remote that Winston had only a dim idea of its nature. A momentary hush passed over the group of people round the chairs as they saw the black overalls of an inner party member approaching. O'Brien was a large, burly man with a thick neck and coarse, humorous, brutal face. In spite of his formidable appearance, he had a certain charm of manner. He had a trick of resettling his spectacles on his nose which was curiously disarming, in some indefinable way, curiously civilized. It was a gesture which, if anybody had thought in such terms, might have recalled an 18th century nobleman offering his snuff-box. Winston had seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years.